Hello and welcome everyone to the solo podcast where I give you my unfiltered media takes straight off the cuff, and today we're going to be talking about the new album from Tricot, Jodeki. So Tricot they're a Japanese band that mix sounds of indie rock, J-rock and math rock, I'd say. And it all comes together in a fairly unique way. I think the band definitely have their own flavour, I suppose you could say. And I've listened to the first three albums and then this one as well. There's two in the middle, I think, that I haven't listened to, so I can't comment on those two. But from what I've listened, from what I've heard from these guys, essentially the sound's always been like fairly consistent. They're incredibly good performers. They're very very tight players. And as a result, all of the records that I've heard have been quite consistent. I'd say the earliest stuff, the first two records, The and are probably the biggest offenders of what I'm about to say. I'd say both of those records have a couple highlights on them, but for the most part have a very consistent sound throughout. And while it's a very fun, energetic, kind of high octane sound, it does usually lead to me not being able to differentiate too much between a ton of the tracks outside of like maybe a few of the singles or remembering some of the vocal melodies here and there, that kind of thing. But on the third record, they actually had a slight shift in their approach that felt a bit more songwriting and a bit more musical. For the record, I've always been a fan of this band. I think this band are quite good for the most part. I actually was lucky enough to catch them live once, and I will say that if you get a chance to see them live, I definitely would recommend it because I think they are a better live band than they are recorded, purely for the reason that the fun energy and the kind of playfulness of everything comes through a lot more live than on recording. But basically, all of that brings us to this most recent album. Like I said, I didn't listen to the two that came before this, but regardless, I don't feel like they've changed the sound a ton. I don't feel like I've missed out too much because this record more or less delivers on the same sort of premise. I would say there's a bit more versatility to this one based on a first listen, because that's kind of the entire point of this podcast. I listen to something just once through and give you my sort of first impressions after letting everything settle a little bit. I would say basically everything here is still the same. They are sounding ever so slightly more versatile, so there's a couple things on this record that you wouldn't have caught necessarily on, especially some of the early projects. There's some synth bits here and there. There's like a ballad on this record, for example. There's a couple slower tracks in general. I would say overall the sound has probably gotten slightly less math rocky and slightly more indie rock or slightly poppier, I guess. This isn't a change I necessarily mind, honestly. I think it works with a lot of what they're trying to do now, which is capture a lot of those vocal melodies and guitar melodies that they've always been very, very good at writing, but they stand out a bit more now that the tracks have a little more variety to them, which I think is definitely a positive change for the band. I will say that not everything on this record pans out supremely well, I guess. Like, there's a couple tunes. I think it was track 6 is the one I've noted down that kind of has an almost funk influence and there's a bit more synth on it, but one of the vocal melodies over a part sounds quite clunky and the track doesn't come together as nicely as some of the others. But I would say for the most part, the tracks that don't work are outweighed by the tracks that do work. And also the other thing is don't get the impression that I think they've massively changed their sound or anything. If you're a fan of Tricot up until this point, you're probably going to enjoy this record. And if you're not a fan up until this point, it's probably not going to change your mind especially. There definitely are still a lot of tracks that capture the essence of what they used to do. In fact, the third track on this album I've noted was particularly great because it captures a lot of what they did initially, but I think it brings it to a slightly more manic place. And as someone who's a huge fan of, mathcore and lots of the kind of like more manic noise rock and math rock, I'm a big fan of the way that track sounds overall. But again, for the most part, this record has, I would say, broadly three categories of songs. You've got the slower songs that have a kind of math rock, almost emo tinge. You've got the poppier songs that are the more high octane, slightly, I wouldn't say maximalist as such, but definitely a bit more, they have a thicker mix and that kind of thing than most of the other tracks here. And then there's like the weird little experiments here and there. And again, overall, it leads it feeling to be, it makes the whole thing feel a bit more varied than Tricot usually are. Like I've already said a couple times, it feels a bit more versatile. And that's to the success mostly, but sometimes to the slight detriment where things don't work out quite as well. But having said all of that, honestly, I still feel like The biggest problem I had with this record on a first listen is, for the most part, I could enjoy it. I could sit there and just have fun while this really, yeah, just playful music is kind of popping off in the background. But even still, I would say it would be cool if they did a bit more to differentiate the tracks even further. Also, I felt like this record was actually a tiny bit too long, and that hurt the versatility they were trying to go for. I feel like if they cut just maybe 2 tracks off this record, the whole thing would have, or I guess each individual track would have stood out just that little bit more, and I think it would have been very much to the, it would have been a positive change for this record, basically. I would say in terms of like the highlights, like I said, track 3 already was a fucking banger, straight up. I just really enjoyed that song. It was pretty great. Dogs and Ducks was one of the more experimental ones that I thought went over really, really well. Track 8 was also a huge banger with loads of really, really cool grooves. It's a very punchy song, leans slightly more in the pop direction. Track 10 was like a 5 minute long ballad, which, I mean, I'm sure they've done stuff like this in the past and I just can't recall, but it was a cool moment for sure. So there's a decent number of highlights across the record, but again, most of the songs here do more or less just sound like Tricot, perhaps slightly more refined and slightly more polished than you've heard them before, but it's more or less the same sound. For those of you who haven't listened to this record, have kind of heard my ramblings up until this point, the main thing I would say Tricot excels at that should draw almost anyone in if you're into, guitar music in general, is they've always had really, really strong interplay between instruments. You'll have like 2 different guitar parts with a bass kind of groove that sounds very, very different, and the drums, it will just be this like incredibly tight in the pocket, kind of like just tight in the pocket beat that will hold everything together, and there'll be, fills that complement different parts and stuff like that. And on top of all of that chaos is kind of happening, the vocal melodies help everything have this really like playful, bombastic energy. So I mean, if that sounds really cool to you, then you should probably check this band out if you haven't already, because I mean, there aren't many bands, I think, that sound like them. Their combination of genres, I think, makes them unique, like I said, but also their performances are always tight, and, the way they kind of, the way they choose to write all the melodies definitely gives them their own flavour. It's just, I guess, perhaps they're a little too consistent in their own writing style, I suppose. But yeah, that's pretty much all my thoughts. I honestly thought this was another really solid Tricot record. They're not a band that I've ever like completely fallen head over heels for, but at the same time, I don't think I've ever heard a song that I've really, really bounced off either. So, if you're into what I've described, I would definitely say there's no reason, not to check this record out, really. It's probably up on YouTube or streaming sites as usual. And I'm almost definitely sure that most people who are into the styles of music I've described will find something to like here. So yeah, that's pretty much all my thoughts on this new Tricot record. I hope you've enjoyed the video, or well, I guess hope you've enjoyed the audio podcast either way. And I'll see you around, alright?